There are nights when the rain seems to have made up its mind completely, settling in not as a passing mood but as a decision. And the night Ellen climbed the lighthouse stairs for her evening watch was, from its very first hour, unmistakably one of those nights. She had taken over the keeping of the small coastal light 3 years earlier, inheriting the post from her uncle when his knees finally grew too stiff for the winding stone stairs. And though the job came with its share of solitary hours, she had never once regretted trading the noise of the mainland for this quiet, weather-bound tower perched at the very edge of the rocks. The Lighthouse Authority had automated most of the coastline's other lights decades ago, leaving only a handful of towers, this one among them, still tended by a living keeper, more out of respect for the tower's particular history and the local fishing community's fondness for a human voice on the radio than any strict technical necessity. Ellen liked to think, on her better days, that she had earned her place in that small, dwindling tradition rather than simply inherited it, though she was honest enough with herself to admit that family connection had certainly opened the door her own dedication had later walked through. Tonight's forecast had promised steady rain through the evening, easing by midnight according to the marine reports she'd checked before climbing up, though the sky outside her small kitchen window had already looked, by early evening, like it intended to ignore that particular forecast entirely. She had packed her thermos and logbook with the same unhurried thoroughness she brought to every watch, checking the weather radio twice more before finally committing to the climb, some old habit of care that her uncle had instilled in her so thoroughly during her training that she now performed it almost without conscious thought. She made her way up the spiral staircase a little after 7, a thermos of cocoa tucked under one arm, her uncle's old logbook under the other, its leather cover soft and dark with decades of handling. The stairs wound upward in their familiar rhythm, worn smooth in the center of each stone step by generations of keepers climbing exactly this same path before her, and Ellen's own footsteps fell easily into the pattern, unhurried, practiced, the particular gait of someone who had climbed this same staircase perhaps 1,000 times before and no longer needed to think about where to place her feet. The lamp room at the top greeted her with its familiar smell, machine oil and salt air, and the faint electric warmth of the great lens itself, already turning its slow, patient rotation as the last grey light outside faded toward evening. Rain streaked steadily down every pane of the surrounding glass, blurring the dark shape of the sea beyond into soft, shifting suggestions of itself, and Ellen settled into the worn wooden chair positioned at the room's center, angled to give a clear view of both the lamp's mechanism and the wide, rain-blurred windows surrounding it. The room itself had changed little, she suspected, since her uncle's own earliest years here, and likely little since the keepers before him either. A brass-cased barometer hung on one curved wall, its needle currently resting firmly in territory that promised nothing good for the evening ahead. A row of hooks near the door held spare oilskins, and a coiled length of rope, kept ready out of long habit rather than any real expectation of need in an age when rescue, should it ever come to that, would arrive by helicopter rather than any effort of her own. The wooden floor, worn smooth and pale in a wide circle around the chair, bore the accumulated evidence of a century or more of careful, patient footsteps, keeper after keeper, wearing the same gentle groove into the boards, through nothing more dramatic than showing up, night after night, and doing the quiet work required of them. She opened the thermos first, pouring a small cup of cocoa and wrapping both hands around its warmth, feeling the day's earlier chill begin slowly to ease from her fingers. The rain's rhythm against the glass filled the small room evenly, a full, layered sound that seemed to come from every direction at once, no single window carrying more of the storm's weight than any other, the whole tower wrapped uniformly in its steady, insistent percussion. Ellen had grown, over her 3 years of keeping this light, genuinely fond of nights exactly like this one. There was a particular satisfaction she had discovered in tending something faithfully through weather that gave every appearance of testing that faithfulness, in climbing the stairs anyway, checking the mechanisms anyway, keeping her small, steady vigil regardless of how insistently the sky outside seemed determined to discourage it. Her uncle had told her once, early in her training, that the job wasn't really about the light at all, not fundamentally, but about the keeping, the simple, unglamorous discipline of showing up faithfully, whether or not anyone out on the water that particular night would ever know or care that she had.
She opened the logbook to its current page, glancing first at the entries from previous nights, brief, practical notations mostly. Wind speed, visibility, any vessels spotted or radioed, the ordinary bookkeeping of a job built almost entirely around careful, patient attention. She noted tonight's conditions in her own neat hand beneath her uncle's older entries further back in the book. Rain heavy, visibility poor, wind moderate from the southwest, before setting the pen down and allowing herself, for a moment, simply to watch the storm working steadily against the glass. The great lamp turned its slow, familiar circuit above her, its beams sweeping out across the invisible water in a rhythm so constant and unhurried that Ellen had long since stopped consciously noticing it, the way a person stops noticing their own heartbeat, despite it never actually pausing. She knew without needing to check exactly how many seconds passed between each sweep of light, the rhythm as deeply familiar to her now as her own breathing, and she found herself settling into that same unhurried tempo, her thoughts slowing gradually to match the lamp's patient circular vigilance. Somewhere far below, she could hear the sea working against the rocks, its usual rhythm thickened and roughened by the storm, waves striking with a heavier, more insistent weight than on calmer nights, though nothing yet approaching anything Ellen would consider genuinely dangerous. She had weathered far worse storms than this from exactly this small stone room, nights when the wind screamed hard enough to rattle the reinforced glass in its frames, when the whole tower seemed to sway very slightly beneath her, though her uncle had always assured her, correctly as it turned out, that the structure had been built to withstand far more than any storm likely to reach this particular stretch of coast. She flipped back further through the logbook, past her own recent entries, into pages filled with her uncle's older, more elaborate handwriting, and found herself, as she often did on quiet nights like this one, reading through some of his longer notes, the ones that drifted occasionally beyond simple weather records into something closer to observation, small, careful accounts of particular storms or particular nights that had, for whatever reason, seemed worth recording in more than their basic practical detail. One entry, dated some 15 years earlier, caught her attention now as it had many times before. "Rain steady since noon," her uncle had written, showing no sign of easing by evening watch. Radioed the Merrow fishing boat at 8, confirmed safe harbour reached before the worst of it. Strange how a night like this settles a person, once the initial worry passes. Nothing left to do but keep the light turning and trust that whoever needs it out there tonight will find it exactly where it's always been. made a second pot of tea round midnight, more for the company of the ritual than any real need of it, and found myself glad, not for the first time, that I chose a life built around this particular kind of patient waiting. Ellen smiled faintly at the familiar entry, recognizing in her uncle's careful words the very same feeling now settling over her own evening. The initial practical alertness of a stormy watch, gradually easing once the immediate checks were complete, into something closer to calm, patient companionship with the weather itself, rather than any real struggle against it. She sipped her cocoa slowly, watching the rain continue its steady work against the glass, and reached for the small marine radio resting on the shelf beside her, more from habit than any real expectation of traffic on a night when most sensible vessels would already have found safe harbor hours earlier. A brief crackle of static answered her check, followed by a familiar voice, gravelly and unhurried, belonging to old Samuel, who kept watch at the harbour station further down the coast. "Evening, Ellen. Quiet night your end?" "Quiet enough," she replied, settling back into her chair. "Rain's steady, but nothing the old girl can't handle. You?" "Same here," Samuel said. "Last boat came in around 6, reported nothing worse than a rough crossing. Looks like we'll both just be keeping each other company through the weather tonight. Same as usual." "Same as usual," Ellen agreed, a small, familiar warmth settling into the exchange, the particular comfort of a ritual repeated so many times it had become less about the words themselves and more about the simple, steady reassurance of another voice somewhere out there in the storm, keeping its own quiet watch in parallel with hers. They exchanged a few more routine details, wind readings, visibility estimates, before signing off with the easy, unhurried farewell of two people who would likely check in again within the hour, regardless of whether anything new had developed. Ellen set the radio back on its shelf and returned her attention to the logbook, though her mind drifted now more towards memory than towards her uncle's careful old entries, towards her own first months in this tower, learning the rhythm of exactly this kind of watch under his patient, unhurried instruction. She remembered, with particular clarity, one of her earliest solo watches, a storm considerably rougher than tonight's steady rain, when she had climbed these same stairs trembling slightly with a nervousness she had been too proud to properly name at the time. Her uncle had met her partway up, despite his stiff knees, simply to walk the last flight beside her, saying nothing beyond a quiet reminder that the light didn't need her to be fearless, only faithful, that showing up frightened and staying anyway counted for rather more than showing up entirely without fear ever could. She remembered, too, how he had sat with her that first difficult night for the better part of an hour before finally trusting her to manage alone, not offering instruction so much as simple, steady company, occasionally pointing out some small detail of the mechanism she hadn't yet learned to notice on her own, more often simply sitting quietly beside her, letting his own calm, unhurried presence demonstrate what no amount of explanation could properly teach. When he finally rose to leave her to the rest of that early watch, he had paused at the top of the stairs and told her in the same plain, unadorned tone he used for nearly everything that she'd do just fine, that the tower had a way of teaching its keepers exactly what they needed to know, provided they stayed patient enough to listen. She had not, in fact, done entirely fine that particular night, growing genuinely rattled around 2 in the morning when a sudden gust had rattled the windows hard enough to send her heart racing, but she had stayed at her post regardless, working through the fear methodically rather than letting it drive her back down the stairs, and had found, by the time dawn finally arrived, that the fear itself had gradually transformed into something closer to quiet pride.
She thought of that transformation often on nights like this one, though tonight carried none of that early trembling, only the settled, practiced calm of someone who had long since made peace with weather far rougher than what currently streaked the glass around her. The rain continued its steady work, hour sliding into hour with the particular seamless quality of a storm that had genuinely settled in for the duration, rather than merely passing through, and Ellen found herself, as the evening deepened further, entirely content to simply sit within it, tending her small, patient light and letting the hours unspool at whatever pace the weather itself preferred to set. Around 9, she rose to check the mechanism properly, a routine task she performed every watch regardless of conditions, running her hands carefully over the great lens's housing, checking the rotation gears, confirming the backup generator remained properly fueled and ready should the main power ever falter during exactly this kind of weather. She logged the fuel levels precisely, as she always did, in a small dedicated section near the back of the logbook, running her fingers briefly along the smooth brass fittings of the rotation mechanism, feeling for any unusual vibration or resistance that might signal trouble developing before it announced itself more dramatically. Everything, as it nearly always was, proved to be in perfect working order, the whole careful system humming along exactly as it had for decades, tended faithfully by a long line of keepers whose names, she knew, filled the earliest pages of logbooks even older than the one currently resting open on her small table. She thought, running her hand one final time along the lens housing's cool brass edge, of the mechanism's own particular patient character, how it required from her not dramatic intervention, but simply steady, attentive maintenance, small checks performed faithfully and repeatedly, rather than any single grand effort. It was, she had come to think, not unlike the job of keeping itself. Success measured almost entirely in the accumulation of small, careful, mostly invisible tasks, rather than any single heroic act. The quiet discipline of showing up properly watch after watch, regardless of whether any particular night demanded anything more of her than simply paying close, patient attention. She paused at the window on her way back to her chair, pressing one hand briefly against the cold glass, feeling the storm's steady vibration traveling faintly through the pane beneath her palm. Beyond it, the sea remained almost entirely invisible in the rain-thickened dark, only the occasional pale flash of foam visible where waves broke against the rocks far below, briefly illuminated by the lamp's own sweeping beam before the darkness swallowed the sight again. She thought, standing there, of all the vessels it had likely passed safely within sight of this exact light over the decades, fishing boats and cargo ships, and the occasional pleasure craft caught out later than intended, each one guided home in some small measure by the same patient circling beam currently sweeping steadily above her head. She would likely never know most of their stories, would never learn whether tonight's rain had troubled anyone currently making their way to harbour, and yet the not knowing had never once bothered her the way she might have expected. The light simply turned, faithful and unhurried, doing its quiet work regardless of whether she ever learned the specific outcome of any particular night's vigilance.
She returned to her chair and her cocoa, now cooled to a pleasant, drinkable warmth rather than its earlier scalding heat, and settled back into the logbook's older pages, finding another of her uncle's longer entries, this one dated from a winter storm considerably worse than tonight's steady rain. Wind reached near gale force by midnight, he had written, waves breaking clean over the lower rocks for the first time I can recall in my own years here. Stayed at watch through till dawn, more from stubbornness than strict necessity, I'll admit, though something in me couldn't quite settle enough to leave the light unattended on a night like that one. Watched the sun come up eventually through a sky finally clearing, and felt, despite the exhaustion, a satisfaction I've rarely matched anywhere else in my life. Some jobs simply suit a person's particular temperament, and I count myself fortunate to have found mine so early and so completely. Ellen read that entry slowly, feeling its familiar warmth settle alongside her own quiet satisfaction with tonight's considerably gentler watch. She thought of her uncle now living out his retirement in the small cottage further along the coast road, likely already asleep at this hour, though she suspected, knowing him, that some part of him still woke occasionally on stormy nights exactly like this one, some old habit of attention refusing to fully release its grip even decades into a well-earned rest. The rain outside showed no sign of easing as the evening wore on, the marine forecast's earlier promise of a midnight clearing seeming, with each passing hour, increasingly unlikely to materialize on schedule. Ellen checked the radio again around 10, exchanging another brief, comfortable round of updates with Samuel down at the harbor station, both of them noting, without any particular concern, that the storm appeared to have settled in rather more stubbornly than either forecast had suggested. "Might be an all-nighter, this one," Samuel observed, his voice crackling faintly through the static. "Rain's not showing any sign of easing my end either." "Wouldn't be the first time the forecast got it wrong," Ellen replied, unbothered. "The light doesn't much care either way. It'll keep turning regardless of what the weather decides to do about the schedule." Samuel's answering chuckle carried warmly through the radio's static. "That it will. Good night, Ellen. Give a shout if anything changes your end." "You too," she said, and set the radio back down, feeling, as she always did after these brief, unhurried exchanges, a small, steady comfort in the knowledge that she was not, despite every outward appearance of solitude, entirely alone in her quiet vigilance tonight. Somewhere down the coast, another patient watcher kept a parallel rhythm through the same storm, and though they would likely exchange no more than a handful of brief radio calls before dawn, the knowledge of that shared attention settled something steady and warm in her chest. She rose again near 11 to make a fresh pot of tea in the small kitchen alcove built into the tower's lower level, descending the spiral stairs briefly for the errand, the rain's sound shifting subtly as she moved through the different levels of the tower, louder and more immediate near the lamp room's exposed glass, softer and more distant in the thicker-walled kitchen below. The small kitchen, barely large enough for one person to move comfortably within, held its own quiet evidence of generations of keepers, a chipped enamel kettle that had likely outlived several of her predecessors, a row of mismatched mugs hanging from hooks screwed into the stone wall at some point long before her own tenure began, a small wooden shelf holding a modest but well-organized collection of teas and dried herbs that Ellen had added to steadily over her own 3 years, alongside whatever had already accumulated there before her arrival. She waited for the kettle with the particular patience of someone entirely unbothered by a few extra minutes' delay, listening to the rain's muffled rhythm against the thick stone walls surrounding her, and carried the fresh pot back up carefully, the steam rising warmly against the cool night air, and settled once more into her familiar chair, wrapping her hands gratefully around the warm cup. Midnight came and went without any sign of the promised clearing, the rain continuing its steady, unhurried rhythm against the glass, exactly as it had since early evening, showing no particular inclination to acknowledge the marine forecast's optimistic prediction. Ellen found herself, if anything, rather pleased by the storm's stubborn persistence, settling more fully now into the deep, unhurried rhythm of what had clearly become, as Samuel had predicted, a genuine all-night watch. She spent the small hours moving between quiet, practical tasks and long stretches of simple, contented stillness,
checking the mechanism periodically, noting conditions in the logbook at regular intervals, and in between, simply sitting with her tea and her uncle's old entries, watching the great lamp's patient beam sweep steadily out across water she could not see, trusting, the way her uncle had taught her to trust, that the light's faithful turning mattered, regardless of whether she could ever properly witness its effect. Around 2 in the morning, during one of the quieter stretchings, she found herself thinking about the particular strangeness of her chosen profession. How few people back on the mainland ever gave much conscious thought to the small, steady lights scattered along their coastlines. How completely those lights simply receded into the unremarked upon background of a safe, ordinary journey, noticed, if at all, only in their absence. Only on the rare occasion when weather or mechanical failure left some stretch of dangerous coast briefly, alarmingly dark. There was a particular quiet satisfaction she had come to realize in tending something whose success was measured almost entirely by its own invisibility, by how thoroughly unremarkable it managed to make even the roughest night's crossing feel to whoever happened to be watching for its beam. She thought of her own life back on the mainland before this posting, how differently she had once measured a day's worth, how much noisier and more visible success had seemed to require back then, and how strange it was that she had needed to climb this quiet, isolated tower to finally understand a rather different, gentler measure of a life well spent. She thought too of the long line of keepers who had occupied this exact chair before her, stretching back further than even her uncle's decades of service, generations of quiet, patient watchers whose names filled logbooks, now stored carefully in a small archive back on the mainland, their individual watches long since folded together into one continuous, unbroken record of faithful attention paid to exactly this stretch of dangerous coastline. She was, she realized, simply the latest link in a chain of such vigilance that stretched back further than she could properly trace, and would, she hoped, continue on considerably longer than her own tenure, whoever eventually took up this same chair once her own knees, like her uncle's, finally grew too stiff for the winding stairs. By 3 in the morning, the rain's steady rhythm had settled so completely into the room's atmosphere that Ellen found herself, despite the watch's demanding hours, entirely at ease within it, her earlier alertness mellowing gradually into something closer to deep, contented calm. She checked the radio once more, receiving only a brief, half-drowsy confirmation from Samuel that all remained quiet at the harbour station, both of them keeping their exchange shorter now, unwilling to disturb whatever fragile rhythm of rest either of them had managed to find within their respective long watches. She allowed herself, in the small hours between 3 and 4, a rare indulgence, settling more deeply in her chair and permitting her eyes to close for short, careful stretches, never fully sleeping, but resting in the particular, practiced manner every keeper eventually learned, alert enough to wake instantly at any change in the mechanism's steady hum or the radio's crackling static, and yet restful enough to carry her gently through the storm's deepest, quietest hours. In one such stretch, drifting somewhere between waking and rest, her thoughts settling on her uncle's earlier logbook entry, watched the sun come up eventually through a sky finally clearing, and felt, despite the exhaustion, a satisfaction I've rarely matched anywhere else in my life. She thought of all the dawns she had already witnessed from exactly this chair, the particular quality of light that arrived after a long night's storm, pale and clean, and entirely without hurry, exactly the reward she had come to understand that made every long rain-soaked watch worthwhile, regardless of how stubbornly the weather chose to test her patience along the way. The rain continued steadily through those small, quiet hours, unbroken and unhurried, filling the whole tower with its patient, enveloping rhythm,
and Ellen, drifting in and out of her careful, watchful rest, found herself thinking that some nights simply asked to be endured rather than rushed through, that the storm's stubborn refusal to clear on schedule had, if anything, given her a gift rather than a burden, an unbroken stretch of quiet, undemanding hours in which to simply sit with her uncle's old words and her own steady, unhurried thoughts, tending a small light through weather that would eventually exhaust itself precisely when it was ready to, and not one moment before. Somewhere past 4, she roused herself properly for a final, careful check of the mechanism, her body pleasantly heavy with the particular tiredness of a long night's watch, and confirmed with quiet satisfaction that everything remained exactly as it should, the great lamp still turning its faithful circuit, the rain still falling steadily against every pane of surrounding glass, the whole tower still standing firm against a storm that showed no more sign of easing now than it had 8 hours earlier. She settled back into her chair for the final stretch of her watch, wrapping the thick wool blanket she kept folded beside her chair more snugly around her shoulders, and allowed her eyes to close once more, this time letting herself sink slightly deeper into rest, trusting the mechanism's steady hum and her own long practice to wake her should anything genuinely require her attention before the grey light of proper morning finally arrived to close out the long night's watch. She thought in that last drifting stretch before something closer to proper sleep finally claimed her, of her uncle's steady, patient voice from all those years ago. The light doesn't need you to be fearless, only faithful, and felt that old lesson settle now not as instruction, but as simple, comfortable truth, fully absorbed into her own bones after 3 years of exactly this kind of quiet, rain-soaked vigilance. She thought of Samuel down at the harbour station, likely dozing now in his own chair between radio checks, another faithful watcher keeping his own parallel rhythm through the same long night. She thought of the unbroken chain of keepers stretching back through the logbook's earliest pages, and forward, she hoped, through pages not yet written, each one adding their own small, steady contribution to a vigilance far larger and more enduring than any single watch could properly contain. She thought too of her own eventual place in that unbroken chain, some future keeper, perhaps not yet born, who would one day climb these same worn stairs, inherit this same worn chair, and find, tucked among the logbook's older pages, her own careful entries sitting quietly alongside her uncle's, 2 more small, patient voices added to a record stretching back further than either of them could properly trace. There was something deeply comforting in that thought, she found, drifting now genuinely towards sleep, the sense of being simply one link in a chain built entirely from small, faithful acts of attention, no single night more important than any other, each one simply adding its own quiet weight to something larger and more enduring than any individual watch could ever be alone. The rain outside showed no sign of stopping even as the first hint of grey began almost imperceptibly to soften the absolute black beyond the tower's windows, dawn still some hours off, but already in its own quiet way beginning its slow, patient approach. It fell steadily over the invisible sea, over the rocks far below, where waves continued their rough, rain-thickened rhythm, over the harbour station further down the coast, where Samuel kept his own steady watch, over the small cottage further inland, where her uncle slept, perhaps, despite his retirement, still listening faintly for a storm his own long habit of attention had never quite released.
Ellen's breathing slowed gradually, matching at last the storm's own patient, unhurried rhythm, her body loose and warm beneath the thick wool blanket, the great lamp continuing its faithful circuit above her, unbothered by her own drifting rest, entirely capable, as it always had been, of tending its own steady vigilance through these final quiet hours until proper morning finally arrived to close out the long night's watch. Somewhere between one soft breath and the next, between the rain's endless patter and the lamp's own slow, sweeping rhythm, Ellen slipped gently into real sleep at last, carried there by the same steady faith her uncle had taught her so many storms ago, that showing up faithfully night after rain-soaked night mattered more than any single storm's stubborn refusal to ease on schedule, and that some kinds of rest arrived most easily and most completely in the very midst of the work a person had learned over long practice to love. The end.